Let me tell you something strange about people who don't have friends. They're not always lonely, not in the way people think. You see, in a world where connection is constant, messages, memes, notifications, being alone feels like rebellion, like stepping out of the noise. And yet, some people, they stay there, in the quiet. Not because they can't make friends, but because something in them stopped wanting to try. Maybe you've seen someone like that. Maybe you are someone like that. The kind of person who walks through crowds unnoticed, who listens more than they speak, who scrolls through endless group photos, not with envy, but with a strange kind of distance. Like watching a movie you once loved, but can't feel the same way about anymore. Here's the part people rarely understand. Not having friends doesn't always mean being unwanted. Sometimes it means being unreachable. Because after enough disappointments, enough broken promises, something changes in you. You stop expecting people to stay. You stop expecting connection to last. So you retreat, not loudly, quietly, slowly, until one day solitude stops feeling heavy. It starts feeling safe. There's a kind of peace in invisibility. You can observe without performing. You can think without defending. Psychologists call this social withdrawal. But that phrase doesn't capture the whole picture. Because for some, it's not avoidance. It's self-preservation. They've seen what happens when you open up too fast. How people listen only until the story stops being convenient. How "let's hang out soon" never means soon. How you can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen, so they choose silence. Not because they hate people, but because they finally learned the cost of being misunderstood. And here's the quiet truth. People who don't have friends often carry entire worlds inside them. Thoughts that never make it out. Emotions that never get translated. They feel everything too deeply. And because of that, they trust slowly, if at all. Society looks at them and says, something's wrong. But maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe they just see things differently. Because when you spend enough time alone, you start noticing what others miss. The way conversations are half performance, half defense. The way most friendships are built on convenience, not understanding. It's not cynicism, it's clarity. And sometimes clarity makes you quiet. There's a strange thing that happens when you spend a lot of time alone. At first, it hurts. The silence feels too loud. You replay old conversations in your head, wondering what you said wrong, what you could have done differently. But after a while, that noise fades. You stop reaching for your phone. You stop expecting replies. And slowly, that empty space turns into something else. Control. Because when no one's around, there's no pretending. No social masks, no need to adjust your tone or filter your thoughts. You just exist, raw, unobserved, unperformed. Psychologists talk about something called hyperindependence. It's when someone learns to rely only on themselves after too many disappointments. It's not confidence, it's defense. A learned instinct that whispers, don't depend on anyone. It'll only hurt. And that's what happens to a lot of people who drift away from friendships. They don't wake up one day and decide, I don't need anyone. It's more like, I've needed people before, and it never ended well. So they build walls, invisible ones, not obvious enough to see, but strong enough to keep people out. Someone asks, you doing okay? They say, yeah, I'm fine, and they mean it, or at least they want to mean it. But deep down, there's this quiet ache, a subtle craving for closeness mixed with fear of it. Because the closer someone gets, the more they could hurt you. That's the paradox, wanting to be understood but terrified of being seen. It's rooted in something psychologists call insecure attachment, usually formed in childhood when love felt conditional or presence wasn't consistent. You learn early that connection is unstable, so you stop chasing it. You start finding peace in predictability, even if that predictability is loneliness. But here's what's strange. The longer you live that way, the harder it is to come back. You forget how to open up. You forget what trust feels like. You even start mistaking solitude for strength. Like being alone is proof you're above needing anyone. But it's not strength, it's armor. And yet, there's beauty in that armor too. It's forged from pain, yes, but it's also the reason they survive. People who don't have friends often become incredibly self-aware. They think deeply, they analyze themselves endlessly. Because when there's no one else to understand you, you try to understand yourself. And that's powerful, but it's also isolating. Because how do you explain your depth to someone who only speaks in small talk? How do you tell someone you crave connection but don't know how to handle it anymore? So you stay quiet, you scroll, you observe, You start finding company in patterns, the sound of rain, late night walks, playlists that somehow understand you better than most people ever did. And little by little, solitude stops feeling like a punishment. It starts feeling like home. There's this quiet fear that lives in people who don't have friends. Not the fear of being alone. They've made peace with that part. It's the fear of being known, because to be known means to be exposed. It means letting someone see the messy parts, the contradictions, the insecurities, the soft places you've spent years covering up. And if you've ever been judged for those parts, or laughed at for them, or made to feel too much, or not enough, you learn to hide. It's not that they hate people, it's that they've learned people don't always handle the truth of who you are with care. So they filter, they shrink, they edit, until it's easier to stay quiet altogether. Psychologists call this vulnerability fatigue. It's what happens when you've opened up too many times and been met with silence, or worse, misunderstanding. You start associating honesty with pain, and so even when someone kind comes along, someone who might understand, you freeze. You nod, you smile, you say, "Yeah, I'm good," but your heart's already pulling away. Because deep down, you're waiting for the moment it all turns again. That's the thing about people who've learnt to live without friends. They read energy faster than words. They sense distance before it happens. They expect endings. They've rehearsed loss so many times in their head that it no longer surprises them. And maybe that's why they keep their circle so small or non-existent. It's not rejection, it's prevention. But here's what most people miss. Beneath that fear, there's still hope. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Because even when they say, "I'm better off alone," there's a part of them that still aches for someone who sees them. Not the version they show, not the voice they curate, but the real unfiltered self underneath. The one that still laughs too hard at dumb jokes. The one that still dreams of sitting next to someone who gets it, who doesn't need everything explained. But the modern world doesn't make that easy. Friendship today feels like a performance. Text chains that fade, plans that never happen. Everyone's busy, distracted, half present. And so, the ones who crave something deeper, they step back. They stop trying to force connections that feel shallow. They choose silence over small talk. Because after a while, you start realizing you can be surrounded by people and still feel like you're talking through glass. And once you've felt that kind of emptiness in a crowd, real solitude doesn't scare you anymore. It feels honest. There's also something deeper, a quiet rebellion against modern friendship culture, where people bond over convenience, not connection, where relationships are disposable and presence is optional. So some people opt out. They say, if this is what friendship has become, I'd rather have none at all. And maybe that's not sadness, maybe that's discernment. Something shifts when you stop chasing belonging. At first, it feels like loss, like stepping away from a language everyone else still speaks. But then, slowly, something else takes its place. Peace. When you've spent years trying to fit, to adjust, to mold yourself into someone likable, walking away feels like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. And here's the paradox. Once you stop needing people to understand you, you start understanding yourself. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts small. You start noticing what drains you, what excites you, what actually makes you feel alive. Not what looks like it should. You start enjoying your own company, not because it's better than everyone else's, but because it's finally honest. Psychologists call this self-differentiation. It's when you develop a clear sense of who you are, separate from how others see you. It's not isolation, it's identity. Because sometimes you have to lose your place in the crowd to find your place within yourself. And the people who don't have friends, they often live in that space. They've turned their solitude into a kind of laboratory for the self. They reflect, they create, they think in ways most people never pause long enough to consider. When you've spent years trying to fit, to adjust, to mold yourself into someone likable, walking away feels like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. And here's the paradox. Once you stop needing people to understand you, you start understanding yourself. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts small. You start noticing what drains you, what excites you, what actually makes you feel alive. Not what looks like it should. You start enjoying your own company, not because it's better than everyone else's, but because it's finally honest. Psychologists call this self-differentiation. It's when you develop a clear sense of who you are, separate from how others see you. It's not isolation, it's identity. Because sometimes you have to lose your place in the crowd to find your place within yourself. And the people who don't have friends, they often live in that space. They've turned their solitude into a kind of laboratory for the self. They reflect, they create, they think in ways most people never pause long enough to consider. They might go for long walks without music, they might talk to themselves out loud, they replay moments not to regret them, but to learn from them. To some, that looks like loneliness, but to them, it's exploration. Because once the social noise fades, you start hearing your inner voice more clearly, and it's been waiting. All those years of adjusting to fit, of laughing when you didn't want to, of pretending to be okay, it silenced that voice, but in solitude it returns, and it's honest, sometimes brutally. It tells you who you've been pretending to be. It reminds you of the parts you buried to keep peace. It forces you to sit with your own contradictions, the things that scare you, the things you've been running from. And maybe that's why so many people can't stand being alone. Because when the world gets quiet, your mind gets loud, and you realize how much of yourself you've never met. But for the ones who do stay in that quiet long enough, something extraordinary happens. They start feeling whole, not because they've found people, but because they've stopped losing themselves trying to be found. This is what psychologists sometimes refer to as self-reliant belonging. It's the ability to feel connected to the world even when you're not socially connected to others. It's not arrogance or numbness, it's integration. Because when you truly belong to yourself, you stop needing constant reassurance. You can walk into a room full of people and not feel smaller. You can spend a weekend alone and not feel forgotten. You exist without explanation. And that's the kind of quiet strength people rarely notice. Something interesting happens once you stop searching for connection. It starts finding you again, but in a quieter way. Not through crowds, not through forced conversations or shared hobbies, but through resonance. You meet someone who doesn't demand energy from you. Someone who isn't afraid of pauses. Someone who sees you, not your performance. And it feels unfamiliar, almost suspicious at first, because when you've lived without friends for so long, kindness feels like a trick. You wait for the shift, for the moment they pull away, lose interest, change tone, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just stay. And you realize something small but profound. You didn't need to fix yourself to be understood. You just needed to meet someone who listens differently. That's how reconnection begins for people who've been alone for too long. Not through effort, through safety. Psychologists call this earned security. It's what happens when someone with a history of unstable or painful connections finally experiences consistent, gentle relationships that rewire how they see trust. And that doesn't just happen romantically, it happens in friendship too. Because true friendship isn't about constant presence. It's about emotional steadiness, the quiet assurance that even in silence, the connection remains. For people who've lived without that, it feels revolutionary. Like, oh, this is what it was supposed to feel like the whole time. No competition, no guilt, no pretending, just understanding. Quiet, mutual, unforced. But here's the part most don't see. Even when genuine people appear, it still takes time. You don't just unlearn your defenses overnight. You don't suddenly wake up trusting again. You test the waters. You share small truths first. You watch how they respond. And when they don't run, when they don't dismiss, when they don't twist your words, something softens inside you. That's healing. Because healing isn't loud, it's not an instant transformation. It's the moment you realize you're not bracing for disappointment anymore. You start laughing without analyzing it. You start texting back without hesitation. You start missing people, but not fearing that missing them means losing them. And suddenly friendship doesn't feel like a battlefield. It feels like breathing. The irony is, when people reach this stage, they often attract others who've lived the same story. Two people who've learned solitude, who've sat in their own quiet for years. When they finally meet, the connection is deeper than any small talk could reach. It's calm, it's real, it's rooted in mutual understanding of what it took to get there. And that's the beauty of it. You don't rebuild your social life the way it was. You build it the way it should have been. Not crowded, not noisy, just meaningful. Because when you've known the weight of loneliness, you stop taking lightness for granted. You stop collecting people and start cherishing them. You stop trying to be interesting and start being honest. That's what friendship looks like when it finally returns to someone who thought they'd outgrown it. It's not fireworks. It's peace. You know what's strange? Once you've lived without friends long enough and then learned to let a few back in, you start realizing something. You never really needed a crowd. You just needed peace. And maybe that peace was never going to come from other people. Maybe it had to start in the quiet, in the ache, in those long nights when you thought nobody saw you. Because that's where you learned who you were without an audience. People talk about loneliness like it's a disease, but sometimes it's medicine. It forces you to sit with yourself until you stop flinching at your own reflection. And when you finally stop running from the silence, when you start seeing it not as emptiness, but as space, you realize how much beauty lives there. You notice how your thoughts begin to settle, how your breathing slows, how the world gets softer when it stops needing to impress you. That's what happens to people who've walked that long stretch alone. They see through the noise now. They know the difference between being surrounded and being seen. Between attention and care, between performance and presence, and maybe they'll always be a little detached, a little distant, not because they don't care, but because they finally understand how fragile connection is, how easily it can break, how sacred it is when it doesn't. That understanding changes how you love. You stop chasing people. You stop begging to be understood. You start showing up for those who show up for you, quietly, consistently, without keeping score. You realize friendship isn't supposed to fill a void. It's supposed to meet you where you're already whole. Because here's the truth. People who don't have friends or who've lived most of their life alone aren't broken. They're observant. They've seen the world without the comfort of belonging, and somehow they've kept their hearts intact. They might love differently, slower, softer, from a distance at first, but when they do, it's real. There's a depth that comes from solitude that can't be faked. It's not the loud kind of confidence that needs to be seen. It's quiet, rooted, certain. And maybe that's what this whole journey was about. Not escaping loneliness, but understanding it. Not finding more people, but finding yourself in the absence of them. Because when you can sit in silence and still feel full, when you can walk alone and still feel connected, when you can let people come and go without losing yourself, that's not loneliness anymore. That's freedom. And the people who've lived without friends, they know that kind of freedom by heart.